Welcome to Moonlit Insomniac. Tonight we'll wander together through the lantern-lit streets of Kyoto, where every step is softened by the glow of paper lights and the hush of evening air. As you follow Haru's quiet journey, you'll find yourself sinking into a slower rhythm, one that gently eases the mind, soothes restless thoughts, and invites sleep to arrive naturally. Let the warmth of Kyoto's night carry you into deep rest. Chapter 1. The First Glow of Lanterns at Dusk. Haru paused at the edge of the street where the first lanterns of Kyoto's evening were beginning to stir. The air itself seemed to soften, the sharpness of day dissolving into something rounder, warmer, easier to breathe. Lanterns blinked alive one by one, their thin paper skins catching firelight like small hearts, gently beating against the dusk. He stood for a long moment without moving, allowing the hush of twilight to seep into him. The city had a way of asking you to slow down, to match its rhythm. And Haru had learned that when Kyoto whispered like this, you listened. The cobbled stones beneath his sandals still carried the faint heat of the afternoon sun, but already the air carried a cool thread through it, like silk sliding across the skin. A shopkeeper leaned from a doorway, taper in hand, and lit the lantern hanging above his entrance. The paper walls blushed a soft gold, throwing out a circle of welcome onto the street. Haru felt the glow catch his own chest, as if the lantern were lighting him too. For a while, he simply walked without purpose, just letting the streets lead. The lanes of Kyoto, winding and patient, had never minded when one walked slowly. His footsteps were quiet, almost reverent, and the stones seemed to approve of his care. Ahead, an oval lantern swayed lightly in the breeze. It was not new. Its ribs bent slightly, its paper creased and wrinkled with years, but Haru found himself drawn to it. He smiled faintly. Perhaps it was that the lantern, like him, carried its own quiet history. Not flawless, but more human for the marks of time. He passed beneath it, and the glow settled over him like a gentle hand on the shoulder. For a moment he felt less like a stranger and more like a guest. A pair of young lovers brushed past, their sandals clicking softly against the stones. They carried with them the faint fragrance of sweet bean cakes wrapped in paper. One of them glanced back and gave Haru a small nod, the Kyoto kind, subtle, restrained, but genuine. Haru returned the nod. In that tiny exchange he felt folded into the rhythm of the night. The street narrowed, and above him wooden eaves leaned together, shading the lane like a tunnel of old memory. A sliding shoji opened somewhere close by, and the sound was so familiar, so ordinary, that it carried more tenderness than a spoken greeting. A cat, mottled gray with a patch of white at its chest, padded across his path, glanced up once, and disappeared into the shadows. The city was alive, but quietly so, like a breath taken and held in peace. Haru slowed near a tea house, whose Norin curtains had just been parted for the evening. Inside, the soft steam of brewing tea curled into the lantern light. A woman arranged ceramic bowls on a tray, each one chipped along the rim. Haru watched her for a moment, thinking how once he might have admired only the flawless, but now he found comfort in what had endured. Perhaps he too, he thought, had grown into his cracks, his worn places, and found them companions rather than blemishes. The evening widened as he reached a small bridge. Beneath, a narrow canal carried the reflection of lanterns, golden ovals floating upside down on the black water. Haru leaned against the railing, its wood smoothed by countless hands, and watched the slow drift of a leaf carried along the current. It turned once, twice, and surrendered itself downstream. Somewhere in the distance, a koto string was plucked, tentative at first, then followed by another. The notes hung in the night air, neither song nor silence, but something in between. Haru listened, and it felt as though the city itself had paused to hear. Kyoto did not rush you. It met you halfway. If you arrived with noise in your heart, it answered with quiet. If you brought a question, It did not always answer, but it made space for the question to rest, like a lantern cradling a fragile flame. The traveler exhaled slowly, the way one exhales after carrying a weight for too long. At a small corner shrine, 2 fox statues stood guard, their stone surfaces worn smooth. A woman knelt there, her movements gentle, as though the whole world might break if she hurried. She placed a sprig of green at the base of the shrine, touched her forehead lightly, and lit a stick of incense. The smoke lifted, curled, then bent back toward her, as if reluctant to leave. Haru, standing at a respectful distance, bowed his head. The gesture felt less like imitation and more like agreement. Gratitude rose inside him, unbidden. A lantern above the shrine glowed softly. It was painted with a simple circle, sun, moon, coin, or just a pleasing shape. Haru didn't know. He didn't need to know. It was enough that it glowed. He turned a corner and nearly collided with an elderly man who slowed but did not startle. His shirt sleeves were rolled neatly, his cloth bag swinging lightly at his side. His eyes, creased with years of observing lanterns just like these, regarded Haru kindly. "You are new to this street," the man said. His voice was gentle, like bamboo bending but not breaking. "New to this hour, perhaps," Haru replied. The man smiled, pleased. The best kind of new. He gestured with his bag toward a narrow doorway, where 3 lanterns hung at different heights, like notes of a song. "My shop is there. Few notice it. You may pass it by, or if you wish to be quietly surprised, you may look." Without waiting for an answer, he continued on, sandals whispering against the stone. Haru lingered a moment, then followed his gesture. The shop was small, almost hidden, its lanterns glowing softly in uneven rhythm. He stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of glue, old paper, and smoke. Lanterns in every stage of becoming hung from the walls. Bamboo ribs waiting for their skins. Half-mended paper stretched taut, brushes left to dry. The same elderly man looked up from his workbench, though now his hands moved with such nimbleness they seemed years younger. "You came," he said simply. "I did." The man lifted a limp lantern from the bench. Its paper sagged, thin as old fabric. With the back of his fingernail he smoothed a crease. "Most think these are broken," he said, "but a lantern remembers its shape. You only need to help it remember." Haru watched, warmed by the man's attention. The silence of the shop felt full, not empty, like tea filling a cup. "Do you sell them?" Haru asked. "Sometimes. Mostly I return them." The man smiled. "Everything is a guest of something else." He offered tea. Haru accepted. They drank without words. The tea was pale green, its warmth modest, its taste so clean it left more space inside the chest than before. Haru felt something unclench in him, as though even his body had been waiting for this sip. When the cups were set down, the man drew out a small lantern, no bigger than a grapefruit. Its ribs had been mended twice. "This belonged to a boy who walked with his grandfather along the river," he said. "When the grandfather passed, the boy asked me to keep the light alive, so I did." He held the lantern close, smiling faintly at its faint scars. Perhaps the boy will return. Perhaps not. Meanwhile, it remembers. Haru looked at it and felt something inside his chest mirror the lantern's gentle persistence. The man set it back down and folded his hands. "Night teaches us something day cannot. Day tells us what is here. Night lets us choose what to notice." Haru carried those words with him as he stepped back into the street. The lantern swayed gently in the breeze. The canal whispered. Somewhere far off, a temple bell began to sound, low and deep. Haru walked on, lantern light falling over his shoulders, as though Kyoto itself had chosen to notice him. Chapter 2. Wooden Bridges Over Quiet Canals. Haru's sandals whispered against the stones as he followed the curve of the street into a quieter quarter. The lanterns here seemed fewer, but somehow their glow reached further, stretching out across the path like pools of still water. The evening air had deepened. What was once indigo now leaned toward velvet, a sky gathering its own hush. The sound of water arrived before he saw it. First, the suggestion of a ripple, faint and elusive, as if the night itself were breathing. Then a soft splash where a leaf surrendered to the current. And at last, the canal appeared, narrow, steady, mirroring the lanterns that hovered above its surface. A wooden bridge arched across it, worn smooth from centuries of footsteps. Haru paused at the entrance, resting a hand on the railing. The wood carried a memory of touch, polished not by polish, but by lives passing gently through. He stepped onto it slowly, as though not to disturb the reflection of the lanterns below. From the middle of the bridge, he looked down. The water carried the lanterns upside down, golden ovals swaying softly. When the breeze stirred, they broke into shimmering ribbons, then reformed as if nothing had happened. Haru thought about how water seemed to forgive every interruption. It never held on to the fracture, never clung to the moment of disturbance. It simply let it pass. He leaned his elbows against the railing and watched a single leaf float by. It caught in a small eddy, turned twice, then drifted on. He followed its progress until it slipped beneath the shadow of a willow leaning over the bank. Somewhere to his left, a faint note rose. A koto string plucked lightly, not yet a song, but an inquiry. Another note followed, answering like a friend stepping into the conversation. The sound spread across the water, delicate and certain. Haru stilled completely, the way one does when a sound feels like it belongs more to silence than to noise. The night, he thought, was not empty but attentive. Kyoto seemed to wait with you, not for you, as though the city understood that rest is not absence, but presence of another kind. A couple approached from the far side of the bridge. Their sandals clicked softly, and their voices were hushed, almost whispers, as though the water itself asked for reverence. They passed with small bows, the kind you give to a fellow traveler who shares the same rhythm of walking. Haru returned the bow and let the silence settle again. On the far bank, a row of houses leaned toward the canal, their latticed windows glowing faintly. A single lantern hung low, its reflection rippling across the water. Beside it, a small boat was moored, its rope tied to a wooden post worn thin. The boat rocked gently, though there was no one to guide it. Haru imagined the countless nights it had waited, tethered patiently, like a dream tied to the shore. He walked to the far side of the bridge, then stopped again. From this angle, the canal revealed another bridge farther downstream, and beyond that, another. Each one glowed faintly, stepping stones of light across the dark. It was as if the city had laid a path, not for the feet, but for the eyes, inviting them to wander further into night. Haru stayed a long while listening. Water against stone, the faint brushing of willow branches, a lantern creaking slightly in the breeze. Each sound placed itself carefully, as if aware that someone was listening closely. He thought of the man in the lantern shop, how he had said, "Night lets us choose what to notice." Here on the bridge, Haru noticed everything. A soft laugh carried across the water. On a veranda nearby, a child leaned against the railing, her face lit by lantern glow. She held a paper fan in both hands and fluttered it experimentally, pretending to cool the water itself. A woman, perhaps her mother, appeared behind her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The child laughed again, softer now, and the sound dissolved into the night. Haru smiled faintly. The bridge beneath his feet seemed to absorb the sound, to hold it safe. He imagined the countless moments the bridge had carried. Footsteps, laughter, sorrow, quiet pauses like his own. Every plank, every nail had heard more stories than could ever be written down. And yet it asked for nothing, only that you step lightly and notice. He walked off the bridge, but not quickly. His steps lingered, carrying the rhythm of water. He followed the curve of the canal where small stone lanterns lined the bank. Moss grew thick at their bases, blurring their edges, as though time itself had decided to grow softer here. One lantern leaned slightly, no longer upright, but its light still poured steadily, as though unfazed by its tilt. Haru liked it for that. The canal narrowed further ahead, slipping between houses so close together their eaves nearly touched. The lantern reflections doubled and redoubled, until it seemed the water carried an entire constellation. Haru stopped to watch, feeling as if he were standing not beside a canal, but beneath a sky. The koto sounded again, this time from farther away, as though the night itself had picked up the string and continued the song. Haru closed his eyes briefly. The sound did not demand attention, it offered it. And in that offering, he felt his chest ease, as though a weight had been placed gently on the water and allowed to float away. A small wind lifted, carrying the faint scent of grilled fish, soy, and the sweet whisper of incense. The mingling of scents was neither sharp nor strong, but layered, like brush strokes in a painting that only made sense when you stepped back. Haru inhaled deeply and let the breath go slowly, as if the city itself had exhaled through him. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself smiling. Not the wide smile of triumph or surprise, but the small, steady kind that comes when one is reminded of their own place in the quiet order of things. He touched the railing once more before stepping off the bridge fully. His hand lingered, as though to take a fragment of the bridge's patience with him. Then he let go, and the bridge remained behind, untroubled, carrying the weight of all who had leaned upon it. Haru continued down the lantern-lit street, the water beside him keeping pace. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell sounded, low, resonant, like a stone dropped into a vast lake. The ripples of its sound moved outward, reaching him where he stood. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the resonance settle in his bones. When he opened them, the night felt a little wider, the lanterns a little warmer, and his steps a little lighter. Chapter 3. A narrow alley of tea houses. Haru turned down a side street so slender that two people walking abreast would have brushed sleeves. The wider lantern-lit avenues gave way to a hushed intimacy, where each doorway seemed to guard its own secret. The cobblestones here were older, less even, and his sandals clicked softly as he walked, the sound muffled by the walls that rose on either side. The air carried a different texture in this alley. Here the night was heavy with the faint smoke of roasting tea leaves, a scent at once earthy and sweet, like rain soaking into soil that had waited too long for it. Beneath it lingered another aroma, subtler, tatami mats warmed by years of footsteps and by summers that had faded into memory. Haru inhaled deeply, letting the mingling fragrances anchor him. On either side, wooden doors slid open now and again, revealing narrow interiors where tea was poured in bowls that gleamed faintly under lantern glow. The light spilling out was never harsh, always a muted amber, the kind that seemed to soften not only the room, but the people inside. From one doorway came the subdued clink of ceramic, from another the faint rustle of silk as someone adjusted their kimono before greeting a guest. Haru passed slowly, not wishing to hurry. He paused before a tea house marked only by a simple lantern, with a single brushstroke painted across it. The mark looked like a circle that never quite closed, as if it invited the eye to wander in and out at will. He watched as a hostess, her hair pinned simply, leaned forward to bow to a pair of guests who entered. Her movements were measured, not for show but because they had always been that way. An elegance born of repetition, like water shaping stone. A hush of voices drifted out, low enough to belong to a dream. Haru did not step inside. He lingered at the threshold, feeling that even the air here was part of the ritual, and that simply pausing was already a way of participating. The lantern above the doorway flickered faintly in the breeze, as if bowing too. He moved on. The alley narrowed further, bending slightly, until it felt as though he had stepped into a world made only for him. Each house pressed closer to its neighbor, their eaves almost touching. Between them hung strings of smaller lanterns, swaying lightly. The effect was as though stars had been drawn downward, suspended just above his head, obliging him to walk through them as one would through a constellation. From one tea house came the quiet plucking of a shamisen. The notes rose like threads of silver in the night, weaving through the scent of tea and smoke. Haru slowed, tilting his head to listen. The player was not performing for an audience, not yet. This was the sound of someone tuning, of strings seeking harmony with silence. He stood still, grateful that he had turned down this alley, grateful that the city seemed to keep placing small gifts in his path. A cat padded out from beneath one Norran curtain, its fur the color of ash and moonlight. It looked at him with unhurried curiosity, then stretched languidly, its back arching into the lantern glow. Haru crouched slightly and whispered a greeting, but the cat, as cats often do, decided the exchange was already complete. It slipped into the shadows, tail flicking once, as though to remind him that mystery was also a gift. The street grew quieter. Even the Kyoto from earlier seemed far away now, replaced by the softer music of conversation muted behind shoji screens. Haru imagined the lives unfolding there, an apprentice learning the delicate rituals of tea, an elder pausing to sip and remember, a traveler resting weary legs after a long day of walking. The walls held it all, the lanterns bore witness, and the night itself seemed to lean close to listen. He paused at a corner where the alley bent again, this time revealing a tea house larger than the rest. Its entrance was marked by 2 stone lanterns on either side of the gate, moss clinging thick to their bases. Their glow was faint, as though they were lit more from memory than from flame. The Norran curtain hanging at the entrance bore the crest of a family that had surely tended this place for generations. Haru stood outside for a while, watching the silhouettes moving gently behind the paper walls. A woman carried a tray of tea bowls, her posture upright, her movements fluid. She placed them down, and a group inside bowed almost as one. The sight stirred something in him, a sense that ceremony was less about rules and more about care, the kind of care that shaped every gesture until even the act of setting down a bowl became sacred. He thought of how many centuries this alley had seen, how many cups had been poured, how many words spoken in low tones, how many lanterns lit and extinguished. Yet here it was, alive in this moment, offering itself again to anyone who slowed enough to notice. Haru closed his eyes for a moment. The air was cooler here, carrying not only the scents of tea and tatami, but the faint mineral edge of the canal nearby. He imagined the generations who had walked this same path, felt the same cool breeze, paused before the same light. He felt himself become part of that lineage, not separate from it, but folded into its ongoing story. He opened his eyes again and smiled, a small inward smile. The alley did not need him to hurry. It asked only that he continue. As he walked further, a lantern swayed directly above him, its paper thin with age, its ribs slightly bent. The glow was uneven, but it persisted. Haru tilted his head upward, grateful for its quiet insistence, its refusal to be extinguished simply because it no longer shone perfectly. He thought of the man in the lantern shop, how he had said, "A lantern remembers its shape." Perhaps people did too. The alley finally opened onto a wider street, but Haru turned once more to look back. From here, the tea houses seemed to form a single painting, lanterns glowing like brushstrokes, shadows layered like ink. The air itself felt painted, as if the night had dipped a brush into silence and spread it gently across the scene. He breathed in once more, slowly. Then, with a small bow of gratitude to the alley and all it had given him, Haru stepped forward into the next part of the night. Chapter 4. The Garden Behind the Gate. Haru's steps carried him into the wider street where the air shifted once again. The closeness of the alley had pressed him into intimacy, asking for quiet attention. But here the space breathed wider, and the night itself seemed to stretch its shoulders. The canal curved along one side of the street, its surface rippling faintly beneath the glow of lanterns that lined the opposite bank. On the other side, houses stood with more room between them, their gardens tucked discreetly behind wooden gates. The gates fascinated Haru. Each one bore its own signature, some marked with family crests carved into the grain, others left plain and unadorned, the wood darkened with age. A few leaned slightly from years of weather, but none appeared neglected. They had the kind of strength that came from being tended without fuss, as if their purpose was not to impress, but simply to endure. He paused before one such gate, narrower than the rest. A single lantern hung above it, not bright, just enough to reveal the faint outlines of ivy that trailed down from the eaves. The gate was closed, but through its slats, Haru glimpsed something within. A garden. The garden revealed itself slowly, the way a shy host might allow you glimpses of their home. First came the sound, the faint trickle of water, steady and patient, as though it had been flowing for centuries and would continue long after Haru had passed. Then the scent, earthy and damp, carrying moss, stone, and the faint sweetness of night-blooming flowers. Finally his eyes adjusted to the shadows, the pale outline of rocks arranged with deliberate care, a lantern set low among them, and the faint shimmer of water rippling under moonlight. He stood there longer than he realized, his hand resting lightly against the gate. It did not feel right to push it open. Some doors in Kyoto, he thought, were meant only to be looked through, never crossed. It was enough to know the garden existed, to know that silence could be shaped with the same precision as stone and water. A cicada called from deep within, its voice steady and insistent. Haru listened as the sound folded itself into the hush of the street. He wondered about the people who lived beyond this gate. Did they pause each evening to hear that same cicada? Did they sit beside the trickling water and let the lantern's glow remind them that even shadows could be beautiful? The thought warmed him. He stepped back slowly, bowing his head slightly toward the gate, as though thanking it for allowing him even that brief glimpse. Then he continued on. The street sloped gently downward, drawing him toward another sound, the ringing of a temple bell. Unlike the faint echoes he had heard earlier, this one was near enough that its reverberation seemed to pass through the ground itself. Each strike rang low and long, a note that began as sound but lingered as vibration. Haru slowed his steps. He remembered the man from the lantern shop. Night teaches us something day cannot. Perhaps this was what he meant. The bell did not tell you the time of day. It told you the depth of night, the weight of silence, the way one moment could be allowed to echo until it filled the space entirely. The bell fell quiet. Haru listened for it again, but no more strikes came. That too seemed deliberate. One sound offered, then silence entrusted to carry it further. A side path branched off, narrow and shadowed. Curiosity stirred in Haru. He followed it, the cobblestones uneven underfoot, until it led him to another small gate. This one was ajar, the wood worn but welcoming. Beyond it he found a garden not unlike the one glimpsed earlier, yet this one felt more open, less guarded. Stepping inside, he found himself surrounded by moss that seemed to glow faintly in the lantern light, its green softened by the night. A stone basin caught water dripping steadily from a bamboo pipe, each drop echoing like a heartbeat into the pool below. The air was cooler here, the kind of coolness that rose from stone and soil long after the sun had gone. Haru crouched beside the basin and dipped his fingers into the water. It was startlingly cold, as though it had come straight from a mountain spring. He let the drops fall from his fingertips back into the basin, listening to the sound they made, small, insignificant, yet part of the whole. A wooden bench stood nearby. He sat, the wood creaking faintly under his weight. From here the garden unfolded itself more clearly, stepping stones leading nowhere in particular, a single pine leaning as though bowing to the lantern beside it, the faint movement of a koi beneath the surface of a small pond. Time thinned in places like this. Haru could not tell if minutes passed or hours. All he knew was the quiet filled him, not like an empty vessel, but like a bowl of tea, warm, simple, complete. At length he rose. Before leaving, he bowed slightly toward the garden. It felt wrong to slip away without acknowledgement. Then he stepped back through the gate, returning to the street. The lanterns along the main path seemed brighter now, as though welcoming him back. He walked on, and Kyoto walked with him, not pushing, not pulling, simply matching his pace. The canal reappeared on his right, this time wider, its surface smoother. A willow leaned over it, its branches brushing the water, making ripples that shimmered in golden arcs. Haru stopped to watch. The lanterns reflected in the water looked as though they were strung among the willow's branches, each ripple turning them into fragments of a dream. He leaned against the railing, resting his elbows there. His thoughts softened, like the ripples themselves. He thought of the boy and his grandfather, of the lantern that remembered. He thought of the tea houses, where every gesture had carried weight. And he thought of the gardens, where silence was not emptiness, but presence. Perhaps, he mused, Kyoto did not offer answers because it wanted you to find them within yourself. Its lanterns, canals, gardens, they all mirrored something you already carried. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the night breathe around him. The cicadas, the water, the distant shamisen, the faint footfalls of someone turning down another street. All of it belonged to a rhythm larger than his own. And in recognizing that rhythm, he found his own place in it. When he opened his eyes again, the willow's branches had shifted in the breeze, and the lanterns swayed. Kyoto did not stay still, but neither did it hurry. It moved at the pace of noticing. And so did Haru. He adjusted the strap of his bag, took another slow step forward, and let the night open again before him. Forward into the next part of the night. Chapter 5. Current of Silence. The willow's branches swayed again, slow as breath. Haru stood watching for longer than he realized, his hand still resting on the railing, the coolness of the wood pressing into his skin. Lantern light shimmered over the canal, turning each ripple into fleeting gold. The water seemed to carry more than light. It carried memory, as though everything reflected upon its surface left a faint trace, lingering even after the image had passed. At last, Haru released the railing and began to walk. The street ahead curved gently, pulling him further into the night. Kyoto did not reveal its heart in grand gestures. It unfolded in fragments, like pages of a book you could only read slowly. Each corner offered a new sentence, each lantern a comma that asked you to pause before continuing. The houses here stood further apart, their gardens hidden behind high walls of wood and plaster. Sometimes a pine branch arched over a gate, its needles sharp silhouettes against the dark sky. Other times, bamboo stalks swayed faintly behind slatted fences, their whispers carrying into the night air. Haru walked as though reading these gestures, one by one, letting them gather without hurrying to understand. He came to a corner where the street dipped slightly toward another canal. This one was narrower, quieter. A small wooden bridge arched across it, no wider than two people standing side by side. Haru paused before crossing. On the far side, a row of houses leaned toward the water, their latticed windows glowing with faint amber light. He could hear voices behind them, soft, measured, never loud. Kyoto, he thought, carried its conversations like it carried its lanterns, warm, steady, never meant to blind. He stepped onto the bridge. The boards creaked faintly underfoot, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet night. He slowed his steps, not wanting to disturb the water below. Looking down, he saw no lantern reflections this time. Instead, the canal carried the pale shimmer of the moon. The orb was fractured by ripples, broken and reformed again. Haru watched it for a long moment, realizing that the moon itself did not mind being scattered. It trusted the water to carry its image back together again. On the far side of the bridge, he turned into another lane. This one felt older, though he could not have said why. The cobblestones were more uneven, the walls leaning slightly inward, the lanterns fewer. The air here carried a stillness that pressed closer, like the silence inside a temple before the chant begins. Haru walked on. His footsteps echoed faintly, then faded. He thought again of the man in the lantern shop. Night teaches us something day cannot. Here, the lesson felt sharper, though not unkind. The night seemed to ask him, "Will you walk with me without asking where we are going? Will you trust me not to hurry?" He nodded inwardly and continued. After a time, the lane widened into a small square. In its center stood a stone well, its rim worn smooth from countless hands drawing water. A wooden roof sheltered it, and beside the well a ladle rested on a stone shelf. Haru approached and ran his fingers along the rim. The stone was cool, damp in places where moss had found purchase. He peered inside. The water at the bottom was faintly visible, a pale shimmer reflecting a lantern set nearby. It looked impossibly still, as though untouched for years, yet he knew it must be fed constantly by the underground streams that ran through the city. He lifted the ladle and dipped it in. The sound of water pouring back into the well echoed in the square, louder than expected, then softened into silence again. Haru held the ladle in his hand, watching the last drops fall from its edge. He thought about how many generations had performed this same motion, drawing, lifting, pouring back. A gesture so simple it might be overlooked, yet repeated often enough to become timeless. He set the ladle back gently. A faint movement caught his eye. Across the square, a paper lantern swayed outside a tea-house door. The Norrin curtains stirred, and a figure stepped out, an elderly woman in a simple indigo kimono. Her hair was pulled back neatly, streaks of silver gleaming faintly in the lantern light. She carried a small tray with a single bowl of tea, which she set carefully on the step before bowing toward the square. Haru did not know if the bow was for the well, the lantern, or simply for the night itself. Perhaps it did not matter. The woman turned back inside, leaving the tea behind. Haru remained still, not wishing to intrude, but he felt a warmth rise in him at the sight. Ceremony, he thought, was not about what was seen, but about what was offered. Even the unseen gestures had weight. He lingered in the square a while longer, then moved on. The streets now wound in ways that felt less deliberate, bending and narrowing without pattern. Haru followed without resistance, letting curiosity choose his direction. He passed doorways left slightly open, where faint laughter drifted out. He passed closed gates where silence itself seemed to guard the threshold. At one corner, He paused before a wall covered in climbing ivy, its leaves catching the lantern light like scales of green fire. He traced the edge of a leaf with his finger before walking on. At last, the lane delivered him to another canal, wider this time. The surface gleamed with lanterns strung along both banks. A stone embankment rose on one side, lined with steps that descended into the water. Haru walked down and sat on the lowest step, close enough to trail his hand in the current. The water was cold, swift, carrying the night along with it. He let his fingers rest there, watching the ripples spread. The current seemed alive. It did not rush, yet it did not linger. It moved at a pace entirely its own, unbothered by banks or bridges or the reflections it carried. Haru felt something loosen in his chest as he watched. Perhaps, he thought, life was not about controlling the current, but about learning to rest your hand in it without fear. He leaned back, supporting himself with his palms against the stone step, and looked up at the sky. The moon was higher now, bright enough to make the stars retreat slightly, yet a few remained, faint and steady, scattered like lanterns left behind. The branches of a pine tree leaned into view, framing the moon with jagged silhouettes. The air shifted then, carrying a faint sound. Haru sat up to listen. It was the beat of a drum, slow, deliberate, each strike separated by long silence. The sound rolled across the water, deep and resonant, like the echo of the earth itself speaking. He rose and followed it, drawn as if by a thread. The drumbeat led him to a temple courtyard. Its gates stood open, the wooden beams painted dark, the roof tiles glistening faintly in the moonlight. Lanterns hung along the eaves, their glow soft, reverent. Inside, a single monk sat before a great drum, striking it with measured care. Each strike was followed by silence, and in that silence the sound seemed to grow larger, not smaller, filling the courtyard like water fills a bowl. Haru stood at the threshold, not entering, but not leaving. He bowed his head slightly, letting the rhythm move through him. The monk's eyes remained closed, his hands steady, as though he had been doing this his entire life and would continue long after this night was gone. Haru listened until the drumbeat stopped. Silence returned, but it was not empty. It was charged, like a field after lightning. He let it settle into him, then bowed once more before turning back into the street. The night had deepened by now. The lanterns seemed fewer, though each one glowed brighter against the darkness. Haru walked with unhurried steps, feeling the weight of the hours yet not burdened by them. He passed another willow, its branches heavy with dew, and paused to watch the drops glisten before falling into the canal below. Each drop disappeared without trace, yet the ripples lingered. At a corner, he came upon a small shrine, its entrance marked by a torii gate. A single lantern burned before it, the flame flickering behind the thin paper. Haru stepped closer. Within the shrine sat a stone figure, worn smooth by centuries of prayer. Its face was barely discernible, yet its presence was undeniable. Haru bowed and pressed his palms together, closing his eyes. He did not form words, not even silent ones. The night itself seemed to pray through him. When he opened his eyes, he felt lighter, as though he had left something at the shrine's feet, something he no longer needed to carry. He continued on. The streets wound again, leading him past more houses, more lanterns, more fragments of night. Each one seemed to fold into him, becoming part of the rhythm he carried. He thought again of the willow, the canal, the drum, the well, the tea left on the step. Each had offered him something, yet none had asked anything in return. He reached another bridge, this one wider, with stone balustrades carved in simple patterns. He leaned against it and looked down at the water. The reflections here were more scattered, broken by the movement of the current. Yet in their scattering they seemed truer somehow, less like an image, more like light itself. Haru exhaled slowly. The night had not given him answers, but it had shown him something better, how to live without needing them. He adjusted the strap of his bag and stepped forward once more. Kyoto's streets opened ahead, endless in their unfolding. He did not need to know where they led. It was enough to walk, to notice, to be carried by the night. And so he continued. Chapter 6. The Well of Quiet Offerings. The old woman lingered in the doorway, her bow held longer than a gesture of politeness might require. Haru felt that she was bowing not only with her body, but with her years, each moment of her life folded into the curve of her spine, the stillness of her breath. The lantern beside her flickered, its paper worn soft by weather, its flame steady despite the night breeze. Haru lowered his head in return, though she did not look his way. He bowed to the well, to the square, to the lantern light that had gathered both of them here at the same hour. In that shared silence, it felt as if they were participating in a ritual older than memory itself, one that required no explanation. The woman lifted the tray once more, turned, and stepped back through the Norin curtain. The fabric swayed gently as it closed, then fell still. The tea-house resumed its quiet posture, the lantern outside swaying like a sentinel breathing in time with the night. Haru remained by the well. The air here was cooler than in the narrow lanes, touched with a faint dampness that rose from stone and water. He placed both hands on the rim, leaning forward slightly. The stones pressed firm and cool against his palms, their surface smoothed by centuries of use. He could almost feel the hands of all who had come before, farmers returning from fields, merchants pausing on their way home, children leaning too far as they tried to glimpse the depths. The water below caught the lantern's glow and returned it in fragments. Haru imagined those fragments drifting upward, not as reflections but as memories rising from the dark. Each ripple, each glimmer of light seemed to hold a story. He closed his eyes and listened. The sound of the night gathered here like an orchestra without conductor, a single cicada's cry from a nearby pine, the faint creak of the tea-house door settling into its frame, the hush of his own breath moving in and out. Even silence seemed to speak in this place, shaping itself into layers that pressed gently against his awareness. When he opened his eyes again, the square seemed smaller, more intimate, as though the night itself had stepped closer to hear his thoughts. He found himself smiling, though without clear reason. Perhaps, he thought, the night did not require reasons. It asked only for presence. Haru circled the well slowly. The stones of the square were uneven, patches of moss creeping between them where water had lingered in seasons past. He moved carefully, each step soft, as though he did not wish to disturb the quiet arrangement of moss, stone, and shadow. On the far side, he paused before a wooden bench tucked against the wall. Its planks sagged slightly, the wood silvered with age. He sat, feeling the roughness beneath him, grounding solid. From this seat, the well stood at the center of his vision, framed by lantern light and the pale spill of moon above. He realized that even without drawing water, the well gave something. Stillness, a reminder that beneath the surface of things, currents moved unseen. He let his gaze soften. The world blurred slightly at the edges, lantern light smudging into shadow, the well fading into suggestion. He allowed himself to drift in that half-seeing, half-dreaming state, where time no longer measured itself by minutes, but by the weight of breath. A sound stirred him, the faint clap of wooden sandals against stone. He looked toward the lane and saw a figure approaching slowly. It was a man, younger than Haru by perhaps a decade, dressed simply in a cotton yukata. His pace was unhurried, as though he too had been drawn here by the well's quiet gravity. The man paused at the rim, dipped the ladle and raised it to his lips. The water poured with a clarity that seemed almost luminous, catching the lantern glow as it fell. After drinking, he bowed his head once toward the well, then turned to leave. Haru watched, noting the way the man carried himself. No rush, no lingering, simply moving as the night required. The act was so simple, yet Haru felt he had witnessed something sacred. The water was not just water, the bow not just a bow. It was the joining of generations, the continuation of gestures that stitched the living to the past. When the man disappeared down the lane, silence settled once more. Yet the echo of his movements lingered, like ripples after a stone has been dropped into still water. Haru leaned back against the wall. He thought of his own path, how many bridges he had crossed tonight, how many lanterns he had paused to notice, how many gardens he had glimpsed and let go. Kyoto seemed less like a city and more like a teacher, revealing lessons in fragments, patience from the alleyways, humility from the gardens, continuity from the wells. The temple bell struck again in the distance. The sound rolled across rooftops and slipped into the square. Haru closed his eyes and let it vibrate through him. It did not ask him to think, only to listen. When the echo faded, he rose from the bench. His legs felt steady, his breath slow. He stepped toward the lane opposite the one from which he had entered. It curved away gently, beckoning without urgency. Haru placed his hand briefly on the rim of the well, a silent farewell, then walked on. The lane beyond was narrower, lined with houses whose plaster walls bore the marks of time, cracks, stains, patches of moss where rain had pooled. Yet none of it looked neglected. Rather, the imperfections seemed to belong, as though the walls carried their history openly. Lanterns hung at irregular intervals, their light falling in soft pools that overlapped like circles drawn by an unsteady hand. Haru walked slowly, noticing each detail. A wooden window shutter slightly ajar, revealing a faint glow inside. A child's getter sandals left neatly outside a doorway. A small stone statue tucked into a niche, its surface worn smooth by touch. Each detail felt like a note in the larger melody of the city, subtle yet irreplaceable. At one corner he paused to watch a shadow shift behind a shoji screen. Someone moved inside carrying a candle that cast a glow across the paper. The figure's movements were ordinary, adjusting a cushion, placing a cup, but Haru found himself captivated. How many such gestures filled this city each night, unseen yet essential. The thought comforted him. The world continued quietly, with or without his notice, and yet he was allowed to glimpse it. The lane ended at another canal, narrower still, almost hidden between the houses. A wooden railing lined the path beside it, and Haru leaned against it, gazing at the water below. Here the surface was darker, more opaque. The lantern reflections were faint, broken by drifting leaves, yet the water moved steadily, carrying those fragments onward. Haru thought of his own life as a river, fragments drifting, sometimes clear, sometimes muddied, always moving. He realized he did not need to hold every image, every moment. The river carried them all, whether he clung or released. He exhaled softly, letting the night take his breath as it had taken so many others before him. The sound of a shamisen drifted faintly from a distance, barely audible above the whisper of water. Haru tilted his head, listening. The notes came irregularly, as though the musician played only for themselves. The melody did not seek perfection. It sought presence. He smiled, remembering the player in the alley earlier. Perhaps it was the same musician, or perhaps Kyoto was filled with players who offered their music to the night, unrecorded, unremembered, except by those who happened to pass by. Haru stood there until the notes faded, absorbed back into silence. Then he stepped away from the railing and continued along the canal, letting the night decide his pace. The street curved once more, leading him toward a small bridge. Beyond it, another cluster of lanterns glowed, marking yet another fragment of the city waiting to be discovered. Haru felt no need to hurry. Kyoto would reveal itself one brushstroke at a time. And so, with quiet steps and an open heart, he walked on. Chapter 7. The Bridge of Listening Shadows. The bridge rose ahead, its arch slight but graceful, spanning the narrow canal like a line drawn by a patient hand. Lanterns flanked its entrance, their light spilling across the boards in uneven patches, as though painting a path of gold that Haru was invited to follow. He approached slowly, his steps steady, the sound of his sandals blending with the faint murmur of water below. The canal here was darker than the others he had crossed. Its surface seemed to gather the night rather than reflect it. Yet, when Haru leaned slightly over the railing, he noticed faint streaks of silver where the current caught the moonlight. The water shimmered not in broad reflections, but in fragments, as if the night itself had broken into 1,000 tiny pieces. Haru rested his hands on the railing. The wood was cool, rough in places where the grain had been lifted by rain and time. He traced one of the grooves with his fingertip, imagining how many others had paused as he did, leaning into the silence of this place. A bridge, he thought, was never only for crossing. It was a place of pause, a threshold, a moment suspended between shores. The night seemed to lean in closer as he lingered. A breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of riverweeds and distant pine. The lantern flames flickered but did not falter, their glow steadying as though the bridge itself lent them calm. Haru closed his eyes briefly, listening, not only to the sound of water, but to the larger rhythm it belonged to. Somewhere beyond the bridge, a bell struck once. Not the deep temple bell he had heard earlier, but a smaller, higher note, perhaps from a shrine tucked into the hills. The sound rippled outward, brushing against rooftops, slipping into alleys, resting finally here, on this bridge. Haru let it pass through him, the resonance lingering in his chest like an echo that belonged not to the ear but to the body itself. When he opened his eyes, a faint movement drew his attention to the far end of the bridge. A child stood there barefoot, holding a small paper lantern. The flame inside flickered, making the child's face glow and fade in shifting light. They did not move, only watched Haru with calm curiosity, as if waiting for him to cross. Haru hesitated. Encounters like this did not feel accidental in Kyoto. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the child before stepping forward. The boards creaked beneath his weight, each sound amplified by the quiet of the night. The child did not retreat. Instead, they raised the lantern slightly higher, as though offering it. When Haru reached the center of the bridge, he stopped. The child remained at the far side, lantern in hand, face unreadable but not unfriendly. The water below carried their twin reflections, the flame trembling, Haru's shadow steady beside it. He lowered his gaze. Perhaps the lantern was not meant to guide him, but simply to remind him that each step was already lit, even if faintly. He looked back up, bowed once more, and continued across. By the time he reached the far end, the child had turned and disappeared into the shadows of a side street. The lantern's glow lingered a moment longer, then faded. Haru exhaled slowly. Kyoto seemed to offer not answers, but mirrors, and tonight it mirrored something he did not yet know he carried. The lane beyond the bridge was narrower, winding between houses that leaned close together, their eaves nearly touching above. Here the lanterns were fewer, and the shadows deepened. Haru felt the intimacy of the space, as though the city had drawn him into its private corridors. The silence was not empty but layered. A faint rustle of bamboo came from one yard. The sound of water dripping from a roof tile punctuated the stillness. Somewhere further on, a dog barked once, sharp but distant, then fell quiet. Haru walked with care, his pace slower than before. The shadows pressed closer, but they did not unsettle him. They seemed to ask him to listen more deeply, to notice the spaces between sounds, the breaths between steps. At one corner, he paused before a small shrine set into the wall. A stone fox sat within, its features worn smooth by time, its posture alert yet calm. A single candle flickered beside it, placed there perhaps earlier in the evening. Haru bowed lightly before moving on, the fox's silent watch lingering in his thoughts. The lane eventually opened into a courtyard. It was quiet, framed on all sides by wooden houses, their shoji screens glowing faintly with light from within. In the center of the courtyard stood a tree, a cherry, though now bare of blossoms. Its branches reached upward like dark veins against the sky. Beneath the tree, a stone bench waited. Haru approached and sat, his hands resting on his knees. The courtyard carried a hush that felt deeper than the lanes, as though it had gathered silence into itself and kept it there like a well. He tilted his head back, gazing at the branches. Though bare, they seemed alive with memory. He imagined the courtyard in spring, petals drifting like snow, lantern light caught in the blooms. Even without blossoms, the tree carried presence, its shape both delicate and enduring. As he sat, he noticed a faint sound, a woman's voice singing softly from within one of the houses. The tune was simple, almost a lullaby, carried gently through the paper screens. Haru closed his eyes and listened. The song blended with the rustle of the tree's branches, the hush of night, the faint gurgle of water from a gutter nearby. It felt less like listening to a performance and more like overhearing the rhythm of life itself. A song not meant for an audience, but offered to the night as naturally as breath. Time thinned again. Haru could not tell if moments or hours passed as he sat beneath the tree. The night did not measure itself in minutes, but in gestures, in breaths, in the soft layering of sound and silence. At last, the song faded. A door slid shut somewhere nearby, and the courtyard grew still again. Haru rose, bowed slightly to the tree, and stepped back into the lane. The path wound onward, leading him toward another canal. This one was narrow, almost hidden, lined with willows whose branches trailed the water like fingers. Lanterns hung from the branches, their light caught in the leaves, making the trees appear as though they glowed from within. Haru stopped to watch the reflections in the water. The lanterns swayed gently, their light scattering across ripples, each fragment trembling but never lost. He leaned against the railing, resting his arms there, and let the rhythm of water, willow, and lantern sink into him. Kyoto moved not with urgency but with patience. It revealed itself one breath at a time, and in doing so, it taught him to breathe differently, to linger, to notice, to trust the quiet as much as the sound. He closed his eyes once more, letting the night carry him. The willows whispered, the water murmured, the lanterns glowed, and Haru, carried by the rhythm, walked on into the shadows that listened. Chapter 8. The silent courtyard lantern. The willow-lined canal faded behind him as Haru followed the curve of the lane. The night here felt softer, as if the shadows had been folded more carefully, their edges less sharp. Lanterns grew fewer, and those that remained burned low, their light gentle rather than insistent. The cobblestones beneath his feet had grown uneven again. His sandals clicked quietly on the stone, each step adding its own rhythm to the hush. Overhead, the sky was clear, the moon high and round, its glow silvering the tiled rooftops. The houses leaned close, but the gaps between them offered brief glimpses of stars, as though the city itself wanted him to remember that beyond its wooden bones stretched a sky without end. He walked slowly. Kyoto did not permit haste at night. It breathed in pauses and silences in the space between steps. Each turn of the lane was a comma, each bridge a semicolon, each courtyard a pause long enough to reframe the sentence of the journey. The lane narrowed until Haru came upon another gate. This one was taller than the rest. made of dark cedar with iron fittings that had rusted faintly with time. The gate was closed, but a small door within it stood open just enough to let a sliver of lantern light spill onto the cobblestones. Haru paused. He could hear water again. Faint, trickling, steady. Curiosity stirred, and he slipped quietly through the open door. The space beyond was a courtyard, larger than he expected, enclosed on all sides by wooden houses. In its center stood a stone lantern, weathered but upright, its flame steady. The light revealed a pond edged with mossy stones, the surface of the water shimmering faintly with koi that turned like drifting brushstrokes. The air here carried the coolness of water and the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine. Haru stood still, letting the scene arrange itself around him. The courtyard was silent, but it was not an empty silence. It was a silence that had shape, like clay molded by countless years of listening. The flame in the stone lantern swayed once in the breeze, then steadied. He stepped closer to the pond, crouching at its edge. A koi surfaced briefly, its scales flashing gold in the lantern light, then disappeared into shadow. The ripple it left lingered, expanding outward in slow circles. Haru watched the circles fade until the water was still again. He sat on a low wooden step that faced the pond. The wood was cool, polished by countless nights of use, as if others too had sat here in quiet reflection. Haru folded his hands loosely in his lap and listened. There was the sound of water, of course, the faint trickle from a bamboo pipe feeding the pond. There was the whisper of the willow branches beyond the wall, brushing faintly against one another. And there was something else too, not quite sound, not quite silence. It was the hum of presence, the weight of time pressed gently into the courtyard stones. Kyoto, Haru thought, had mastered the art of letting silence speak. His gaze returned to the stone lantern. Its surface was rough, carved centuries ago, its lines softened by weather. Yet the flame inside was new, lit perhaps just this evening. Old stone, new light, past and present folded together. He thought of the man in the lantern shop who had spoken of how a lantern remembers its shape. Perhaps this was true of courtyards too, and ponds and streets. Perhaps memory did not vanish with the years, but settled into the stones, into the wood, into the silence itself, waiting for someone willing to notice. Haru closed his eyes and let the silence touch him. For a moment he felt as though he too had become part of the courtyard, not separate from it, but folded into its ongoing memory. A faint sound stirred him from stillness. Footsteps, soft against the wood, came from across the courtyard. Haru opened his eyes to see an elderly man emerge from one of the sliding doors. His kimono was plain, his hair silver, his posture upright. He carried no lantern, yet he moved as though he needed none, his steps certain even in shadow. The man did not look at Haru at first. Instead he approached the pond, crouched low, and dipped his hand into the water. He let the water slip between his fingers, watching the ripples spread. Then he looked up and met Haru's gaze. Neither spoke. The lantern flame flickered between them, and the silence filled with an unspoken recognition. After a long moment, the man bowed his head slightly. Haru returned the bow. Then the man rose, turned, and disappeared again into the house, the shoji sliding shut with a sound softer than breath. Haru remained where he was, heart steady, breath even. The encounter felt like a brushstroke on a scroll, brief, deliberate, leaving its mark without the need for explanation. Time drifted. Haru did not know how long he sat in the courtyard, only that eventually he felt the urge to rise. He bowed slightly toward the pond, the lantern, the silence. Then he stepped back through the open door, returning to the lane. The air outside felt different now, as though the courtyard had altered the rhythm of the night. Haru walked more slowly, his gaze softer, his breath deeper. The lane wound onward, leading him toward another bridge, narrower than the last. This one had no lanterns flanking its sides, only the pale light of the moon spreading across its boards. He stepped onto the bridge. The water below was dark, reflecting only fragments of sky. Yet when Haru leaned over, he noticed a faint glimmer, small fish darting beneath the surface, catching the moonlight in fleeting flashes. They moved quickly, then vanished, leaving only ripples behind. He lingered there, elbows resting lightly on the railing. The water carried no reflection of lanterns this time, only the trembling silver of the moon. He realized that not all beauty revealed itself through light. Some revealed itself through shadow, through movement, through the patience of looking longer than habit required. On the far side of the bridge, a row of houses stood in silence. Their shutters were closed, but the faint scent of incense drifted into the air, curling upward in invisible spirals. Somewhere within, someone had offered a prayer. Haru inhaled the scent, letting it linger in his chest. It carried no words, yet it felt like language. Perhaps prayers, like silence, needed no translation. The lane narrowed again until it opened into another square. In its center stood a single maple tree, its leaves dark silhouettes against the night sky. A stone basin rested beside it, fed by a bamboo pipe. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly in the square, steady and patient. Haru approached, crouching to dip his fingers into the basin. The water was cold, startling against his skin, yet refreshing. He let it drip from his hand back into the basin, listening to the small sound it made, a sound so small it might have been lost in daylight, yet here in the night it rang clear. He stood slowly, bowing his head toward the basin. The night seemed to ask nothing of him except this: to notice, to pause, to bow. As he left the square, a faint wind stirred the maple leaves. They whispered together, their sound like pages turning in a book. Haru looked up and smiled. Kyoto, he thought, was a book you could never finish. You could only read one page at a time, one night at a time, each pause another sentence in a story still being written. And so he continued, letting the story unfold, step by step, lantern by lantern, silence by silence. Chapter 9. The Bell and the Garden Gate. The night had reached a depth that seemed to erase the edges of time. Haru could not have said whether it was late or merely timeless. The streets were emptier now, lanterns more sparse, shadows longer and softer. Yet the city did not feel deserted. It felt as though it had drawn inward, holding its breath, waiting for those willing to listen. Haru walked slowly along a cobblestone lane, the air cooler now, tinged with the faint mineral edge of stone. The canal curved away behind him, and the houses pressed closer once more, their latticed windows dark, their wooden shutters closed like eyes in rest. Somewhere above, a wind stirred through pine needles, and their sigh fell like a hush over the rooftops. He thought again of the words the lantern seller had spoken. Night teaches us something day cannot. Tonight, every step seemed to carry that lesson deeper. The lane bent toward a small rise, and Haru followed it. At the top he found a temple gate standing silent. Its wooden beams were heavy and weathered, carved with faint marks left by hands of centuries past. The doors were shut, but the gate itself remained open, as though inviting even those who walked outside to pause and notice. Beyond the gate, a faint glow came from within the temple grounds. A single paper lantern hung on a wooden post, its light dim yet steady. Beneath it, stone steps descended toward a courtyard hidden in shadow. Haru stood at the threshold of the gate and bowed lightly. He did not step inside. Some spaces in Kyoto, he thought, did not require entry to be felt. The act of pausing, of acknowledging, was enough. As he lingered, a bell struck. It was not the heavy temple bell he had heard earlier, but a smaller one, its tone lighter, clearer, though no less resonant. The sound spread through the night like water poured into a still pool, rippling outward, touching walls, roofs, lanterns, and the listening heart alike. The bell rang once more, then fell silent. Haru closed his eyes and let the vibration settle in his chest. It was as if the city itself had exhaled, reminding him that silence was not absence but continuation. He moved on, leaving the temple gate behind, though its sound followed him like an echo stitched into the night. The lane descended again, curving toward a narrow side street. Haru turned, drawn by the faint glow of another lantern. This one hung above a low wooden gate, smaller than most, its frame crooked from age but still upright. The gate was slightly ajar, and through it, Haru glimpsed something beyond. A small garden washed in moonlight. Curiosity stirred. He stepped closer, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath him. Through the opening he could see a stone path winding between moss-covered rocks. A plum tree leaned over the path, its blossoms pale in the darkness, petals scattered like fragments of the moon upon the ground. The garden carried a quiet so complete it felt as though the world outside had vanished. Haru stood at the threshold, uncertain. He did not wish to intrude, yet the gate's openness seemed like an invitation. Slowly, respectfully, he stepped inside. The garden unfolded in layers. First, the sound, a trickle of water falling from a bamboo pipe into a stone basin, each drop steady and deliberate. Then the scent, earth, moss, faint sweetness from the blossoms drifting through the air. Finally the sight, the moonlight spilling over stones, the pale shimmer of a pond, the faint glow of a lantern resting low among the rocks. Haru walked carefully along the path, each step deliberate, as though the stones themselves were guiding him. He reached the basin and crouched beside it. The water was clear, its surface trembling faintly with each falling drop. Haru dipped his fingers into it. The coldness startled him, sharp and refreshing, carrying the chill of a mountain spring. He let the drops fall back, listening to the small sound they made as they rejoined the basin. For a long moment he remained crouched there, watching the water, listening to its rhythm. The night seemed to fold more closely around him, the garden a pocket of stillness carved into the city's heart. A wooden bench stood beneath the plum tree. Haru sat, the wood creaking softly under his weight. The blossoms above stirred faintly in the breeze, releasing a few petals that drifted down, landing soundlessly on the ground. He reached to pick one up, holding it gently in his palm. Its fragility astonished him, yet within that fragility lay its beauty. He thought of the lanterns he had passed, their paper thin, their ribs bent, yet their light unwavering. He thought of the stone wells and basins, worn smooth by countless hands, yet still giving water. He thought of the city itself, old yet unhurried, its silence carrying more wisdom than words. Perhaps, he thought, beauty was not in perfection but in persistence. In the way lanterns continued to glow, water continued to fall, petals continued to drift. In the way silence continued to hold everything without judgment. He sat until his breath matched the rhythm of the garden, in, like the trickle of water, out, like the falling petals. Time became indistinct. Perhaps only minutes passed, perhaps an hour. The garden did not measure. Eventually, Haru rose. He bowed slightly toward the basin, the plum tree, the unseen presence that seemed to linger within the space. Then he turned back toward the gate. As he stepped through, he noticed a small plaque set in the wood. The characters, worn but legible, read, "To see the moon, lower your eyes." Haru smiled faintly. He understood. The garden had not asked him to look upward, but inward, to find the reflection of moonlight already present in water, stone, and silence. The lane beyond the gate felt altered now, as though carrying some trace of the garden's stillness with it. Haru walked on, his steps slower, his gaze softer. The air had grown cooler still, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a distant hearth. As he rounded a corner, he found himself before another canal. This one was narrower, its banks lined with stones. A willow leaned over it, its branches trailing the water like brushes painting lines across the surface. The reflection of the moon wavered there, broken and mended again with each ripple. Haru leaned against the railing, watching. He thought of the basin, the trickling water, the steady flame in the lantern. He thought of the plaque, "To see the moon, lower your eyes." The water shimmered, and in it he saw not only the moon but himself, fragmented, scattered, reformed. He stood there until the night seemed to breathe with him. Then, adjusting the strap of his bag, he stepped once more into Kyoto's unfolding story. Chapter 10. The Lantern by the Bridge. The night continued its unhurried unfolding. Haru walked along the narrow lane until it sloped gently downward once more, leading him toward the sound of water. It was not the rushing of a river or the gurgle of a stream, but the quieter presence of a canal, constant, steady, flowing with the patience of centuries. Kyoto seemed stitched together by water, each canal a thread weaving between houses, tea houses, gardens, and temples. As he approached, the air grew cooler, touched with a faint dampness that rose from the stone embankments. A low wooden bridge arched over the canal ahead, its frame simple, its boards worn smooth by countless footsteps. Haru slowed. Lanterns stood at each end of the bridge, their glow gentle, their reflections trembling on the water below. The bridge seemed to invite pause rather than passage. Haru placed a hand on the railing, its wood cool beneath his palm, and looked down. The canal carried not just the lantern light, but the pale shimmer of the moon, fractured into ripples that broke and healed with each passing breeze. He thought of how water remembered every touch, of wind, of leaf, of falling petal, and carried those impressions with it until they dissolved into flow. He leaned on the railing, letting his breath slow, letting his thoughts scatter and return as the moon's image did. In that moment, he felt less like a man walking through a city and more like part of the current itself, moving without hurry, belonging without question. Across the bridge, a small shrine stood tucked into the corner where two streets met. Its torii gate was modest, the wood dark with age, but a single stone lantern glowed beside it, casting a circle of light onto the steps. Haru crossed the bridge and approached. The shrine was quiet, its courtyard no larger than a room, yet the air within it held a density of presence that felt larger than the space itself. A rope hung before the altar, a bell suspended from it. Haru reached up, took the rope lightly, and gave it a gentle shake. The bell rang, its tone bright yet carrying depth, a sound that seemed to pierce through layers of silence. He bowed his head, hands pressed lightly together. He did not offer words, no prayer, no request. Instead, he let the sound itself be enough, as though the act of listening was its own devotion. When the bell's vibration faded, the night seemed deeper for its absence. Haru bowed once more, then stepped back, leaving the shrine as quietly as he had entered. The street beyond curved along the canal, the houses on either side standing further apart now. Some bore wide gates of darkened wood, others opened onto narrow gardens where shadows hinted at stone lanterns, stepping stones, and leaning pines. From one house, the faint scent of incense drifted into the street, mingling with the cool dampness of the water. Haru walked slowly, letting each detail arrive without needing to gather them into meaning. Kyoto did not ask to be understood. It asked only to be noticed. He paused when he reached a corner where the canal widened into a small basin. A willow tree leaned far over the water, its branches brushing the surface in long, delicate arcs. Lanterns lined the opposite bank, their reflections caught in the willow's tresses, as though light itself had been woven into the branches. Haru stood watching. The scene reminded him of a painting, one of those old ink scrolls where the artist left more white space than image, as if to suggest that emptiness was as important as form. He thought of how often silence worked the same way, not as absence, but as frame, giving shape to what mattered. As he lingered, the faint sound of a shamisen reached his ears. It came from across the canal, from a tea house partly hidden behind a curtain of bamboo. The notes were soft, unhurried, each one plucked with the care of someone who knew that music did not need to rush to be heard. Haru listened from where he stood, the sound carrying across water, mingling with the rustle of willow branches and the faint creak of the bridge behind him. It felt less like performance, and more like a conversation with the night itself. He closed his eyes, letting the shamisen notes fall into him like pebbles into a still pond, each one sending ripples outward. The music did not fill the silence, it revealed it, the way lanterns revealed the night by deepening its shadows. When the music faded, he opened his eyes again. The tea house curtain stirred, lanterns swayed, and the willow branches brushed the water once more, as if nothing had changed. Yet Haru felt altered, as though something within him had shifted into a deeper rhythm. The street turned away from the canal, leading him toward another part of the city. Here, the houses were older, their roofs lower, their walls leaning inward as though sharing secrets across the narrow lane. The lanterns were fewer, and the shadows seemed thicker, but Haru did not feel unease. Instead, the darkness felt like a cloak, wrapping him in its quiet. As he walked, he noticed a stone well set into a small square between the houses. Its rim was worn smooth, and a wooden ladle rested on the edge. He stepped closer, peered inside. The water at the bottom glimmered faintly, catching a trace of lantern light from a nearby door. Haru lifted the ladle, dipped it into the well, and raised it. The sound of water pouring back echoed briefly, then faded into silence once more. He thought about how many hands had repeated this simple act, day after day, year after year, until it became less an action and more a ritual, an unspoken conversation between the living and the city itself. He set the ladle back gently, bowed his head slightly, and moved on. The lane opened into a small courtyard where a tree stood at the center, its branches stretching wide. Beneath it, a stone bench rested, half hidden in shadow. Haru sat, the coolness of the stone pressing through his clothes. From here he could see the rooftops rising against the night sky, their outlines sharp yet softened by distance. The moon hung low above them, pale and steady. He thought of all the nights it had watched over this city, the countless generations who had walked these same streets, paused at these same lanterns, listened to these same bells. He closed his eyes, listening. Cicadas droned faintly from some hidden grove. A dog barked once in the distance, then fell silent. The night seemed endless, yet contained in each sound was the reminder that time was moving, carrying everything with it. Haru opened his eyes again and rose from the bench. He walked on, letting the streets guide him without thought of direction. Each turn, each lantern, each gate felt like a page in a book that could only be read slowly, line by line, without skipping ahead. At last he reached another bridge. This one was narrower, its railings lower, its wood more weathered. A single lantern hung from a post at its center, its paper yellowed with age, its glow uneven but enduring. Haru placed his hand on the railing and stepped onto the bridge. The boards creaked softly beneath him. He paused at the lantern, tilting his head upward. Its light was not perfect, its paper bent, its ribs crooked. Yet it burned quietly, without asking for more than the night itself to hold it. He thought of the lantern seller's words again. A lantern remembers its shape. Perhaps people did too. Perhaps even when bent, worn, or uneven, they carried within them a memory of wholeness that no darkness could extinguish. Haru smiled faintly. He bowed his head toward the lantern, then continued across the bridge, letting the night lead him onward. Chapter 11. The House of Quiet Lanterns. The bridge faded behind him, its creaking boards and weathered lantern now part of the night's memory. Haru stepped into another lane, narrow but not unfriendly, its cobblestones gleaming faintly with the sheen of dampness. The houses here leaned closer, their eaves stretching toward one another like old neighbors trading confidences over the street. Shadows lay thicker between them, but the lanterns spaced at intervals along the lane carried their glow steadily, never too bright, never too dim. He slowed his pace. The night seemed to request it, as though each step needed to land in rhythm with the silence. His breath followed, deepening without effort, as though his lungs too had learned to walk in time with Kyoto's stillness. A soft sound rose from ahead, the patter of water, faint yet persistent. Haru followed it until he came upon a narrow canal running between two rows of houses. A simple plank bridge spanned it, no railing, just wood laid smooth by years of footsteps. He crossed carefully, pausing at the center to look down. The water was shallow here, stones visible beneath the rippling surface. Lantern light caught the current and broke into shards, like gold scattered in the stream. He lingered, then stepped down into the street beyond. The lane soon opened into a quiet square, unmarked on any map but carefully tended by the life around it. At its center stood a small shrine, no larger than a garden shed, with a sloping roof and a single lantern glowing before it. A rope hung at the entrance, tied to a bell. Haru approached slowly. He did not ring the bell this time. Instead, he stood before it in silence, his hands folded at his sides. The lantern's glow seemed to expand the longer he watched, as though the light breathed. He thought of how many prayers had been whispered here, how many steps had paused before this same rope, how many heads had bowed beneath the same sloping roof. The thought steadied him. Not because the prayers promised answers, but because they revealed how deeply human it was to pause, to ask, to listen. When he finally turned away, it was not with reluctance, but with a quiet sense of carrying the place within him, as though a piece of its stillness had settled into his chest. The square branched into 3 streets. Haru chose the one that curved left, where lanterns lined a wall of white plaster streaked with age. The wall rose high, enclosing a garden hidden from view, though he could sense its presence, the faint rustle of bamboo, the fragrance of pine, the coolness that seeped into the air around it. Kyoto often revealed itself this way, indirectly, letting you feel what could not be seen. He walked on until the street bent again and opened onto something unexpected, a house unlike the others he had passed. It was not larger nor grander, but it carried a presence that made Haru pause. Its wooden gate stood slightly ajar, and above it hung a row of lanterns, not 2 or 3, but many, suspended at different heights. Some were round and plain, others painted with faded patterns of cranes or plum blossoms. Their papers were worn, their frames uneven, yet together they glowed with a warmth that reached beyond the gate. Haru stepped closer, curiosity stirring. He did not push the gate further open. Instead, he stood at its threshold, peering through. Within, the courtyard stretched wide, the lanterns casting their glow over a stone path that led deeper toward the house. Moss spread between the stones, soft and green, and a pine tree leaned in the corner, its branches stretched like arms offering shade. Beneath it, a low stone basin caught the light, water trickling steadily from a bamboo pipe into its surface. But it was not the tree, nor the basin that held Haru's gaze. It was the lanterns. Dozens of them, perhaps more than he could count, hung from beams, branches, hooks, and eaves. Each one glowed differently, some steady, some flickering, some so faint it seemed they would extinguish, yet never did. Together they formed a constellation of earthbound stars, each carrying a memory of light. Haru thought of the lantern seller's words again. A lantern remembers its shape. Perhaps these lanterns gathered here remembered not just themselves, but the hands that had made them, the nights they had illuminated, the faces they had shone upon. Perhaps this house was less a dwelling and more a resting place for memory itself. He stood at the gate for a long time, simply breathing, letting the glow soak into him. A faint sound stirred within the house, the sliding of a shoji door, the creak of wood. Haru's breath caught, though he did not move. The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped into the lantern light. It was an elderly man, his back bent but his movements steady. He wore a plain gray kimono, the sleeves loose, the fabric soft with age. His hair was white, pulled into a small knot at the back of his head. In his hands he carried a single lantern, its paper fresh, its frame straight. The man did not seem surprised to find Haru at the gate. He merely lifted the lantern slightly, as though offering it for Haru to see, then walked to a beam near the pine tree and hung it among the others. He stood there for a moment, adjusting its rope until it hung level, then stepped back to look at it. His posture was quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not from achievement but from care. Then, just as simply, he turned and went back inside, sliding the shoji door shut behind him. Haru exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. He bowed slightly toward the courtyard, though no one was there to see it, then stepped back from the gate. The street beyond seemed brighter after that, though he could not say whether the lanterns truly burned more strongly, or whether the memory of the courtyard had lingered in his eyes. He walked on, his steps light, the rhythm of his breath steady. The night had grown deeper, yet it did not feel heavy. It felt layered, like a fabric woven of sound, shadow, scent, and light. From somewhere nearby, the faint notes of a flute drifted, soft and wavering. Haru turned down another street, following the sound. It led him to a small garden tucked behind a low wall, its gate open. Inside, a young man sat cross-legged on a stone, flute in hand, playing into the night. His eyes were closed, his posture relaxed, as though the music moved through him rather than from him. Haru did not enter. He listened from the street, letting the notes wash over him, rise and fall, break and return, much like the ripples of the canals. It was not performance. It was practice, devotion, breathing given shape. When the flute fell silent, Haru bowed in gratitude, though the young man never opened his eyes. Then he continued walking. The night stretched on. He passed another canal, crossed another bridge, paused to watch koi move in the darkness beneath the water. He lingered before the gates of houses, admired the silhouettes of trees leaning against the sky, listened to the cicadas drone their endless song. Each fragment seemed to gather into something larger, not a lesson exactly, not a message, but a rhythm, a way of being that required no striving, only noticing. Kyoto did not demand that he learn it. It simply offered the chance to walk within it, step by step, breath by breath, lantern by lantern. And so he walked, deeper into the night, carrying the glow of the lanterns with him. Chapter 12. The Garden of Listening Stones. The night deepened, though Haru could not say what hour it was. Kyoto seemed to move outside of clocks. Its lanterns marked not time but presence, each one a pulse of stillness burning in the dark. He walked as if the streets themselves were unfolding for him alone, though he knew others had walked them countless times before, their footsteps layering quietly beneath his own. A breeze brushed the lane, carrying the faint scent of pine smoke. Somewhere nearby, a hearth must have been lit. Haru turned his head, watching the way the smoke thinned into the night. It did not cling. It drifted freely, as though even fire wished only to breathe in Kyoto. He followed the scent until the lane opened toward another canal. This one was narrow, almost hidden. its banks hemmed in by stone walls softened with moss. No bridge spanned it, only a stepping stone path, 5 stones in a row, each just wide enough for 1 foot at a time. Haru paused, then stepped carefully across. The stones rocked faintly under his weight, their edges smoothed by years of water brushing against them. On the far side, he entered a path lined with tall bamboo. Their stalks swayed faintly in the breeze, knocking gently against one another. The sound was hollow, yet soft, like 100 muted bells, striking in no particular rhythm. Haru slowed his steps. The bamboo seemed less like plants and more like listeners, leaning close, their whispers following him as he passed. The path bent sharply, and then he saw it. A garden laid wide and low, open to the night sky. Lanterns stood at its edges, their light casting long, angled shadows across raked gravel. The gravel patterns swirled in wide arcs, concentric circles and flowing lines, each one carved with meticulous care. Stones of different shapes rose from the gravel, tall pillars, flat slabs, clustered mounds. Each stone seemed less like an object and more like a presence, as though it had been placed not for appearance, but for listening. Haru stepped to the edge of the gravel, hesitant to enter. A small wooden bench stood nearby, so he lowered himself onto it. From there the garden stretched before him like an open page. He let his eyes trace the curves of the raked gravel. Each line seemed to carry intention, yet none of them led to an ending. They curved into one another, folded back, began again. The stones stood steady among them, unmoved by the flowing lines, as if anchoring silence itself. Haru breathed slowly. The garden did not ask for interpretation. It asked only that he look. Minutes passed, or perhaps longer. The night held no urgency. The lanterns flickered faintly, the bamboo rustled, and the stones listened. Haru found himself wondering, not what the garden meant, but whether the garden was wondering about him. Did the stones notice his presence? Did the gravel lines recognize his gaze? Did the lanterns keep a memory of everyone who had ever sat on this same bench, watching in stillness? The thought did not unsettle him. It steadied him. He felt less like an intruder and more like part of the arrangement. Another stone, another line, another pause in the pattern. A sound rose, faint but clear, the steady trickle of water. Haru turned his head and saw at the far corner of the garden a small fountain built of stone. Water slipped from a bamboo pipe into a basin, drop by drop. The basin overflowed into the gravel, which carried the water away unseen. The sound blended with the silence, not breaking it but completing it, as though silence without water would have been unfinished. Haru closed his eyes for a moment. He let the trickling sound enter his chest, steady and unhurried. It felt less like listening and more like remembering. When he opened his eyes again, he saw movement at the far edge of the garden. A figure had stepped out from a sliding door, their silhouette framed by the lantern glow. It was a woman, dressed in a pale kimono, her sleeves long and flowing. Her hair was bound simply, without ornament. She carried a small rake in her hands. Haru watched as she stepped onto the gravel with slow precision, her bare feet making no sound. She moved to one edge of the garden and lowered the rake. With a steady motion, she began to draw new lines through the gravel. The sound was soft, a whisper of stone against stone. She worked without haste, each pull of the rake curving into another, her body moving as though in rhythm with the night itself. Haru sat still, hardly daring to breathe too loudly. He realized that what he was witnessing was not a performance, but a practice, an act of devotion, as natural as the trickle of water into the basin. The woman raked until the lines had formed a new pattern, spirals flowing outward from one of the taller stones. Then she paused, lifted the rake, and stood quietly for a moment. She bowed toward the stone, then turned and walked back into the house, sliding the door shut behind her. Haru let the silence settle again. The lines she had left gleamed faintly under the lantern light, newly born, yet already timeless. He rose from the bench and approached the edge of the gravel. He did not step onto it. Something in him knew it was not his place, but he bowed slightly, as she had done toward the stones. When he straightened, he found his breath deeper, his shoulders looser, his thoughts quieter. He realized he had been searching less for answers and more for this feeling, this quiet alignment, where nothing needed to be solved because nothing was out of place. The garden seemed to bow back in return, though of course it did not move. Leaving the bench behind, Haru followed another path that wound around the garden's edge. The bamboo grew thicker here, their shadows long and overlapping. The sound of their hollow knocking followed him, but it no longer sounded like whispering. It sounded like encouragement, like applause muffled into stillness. The path curved again and brought him to a small wooden gate. Beyond it lay another narrow lane, darker than the one he had entered from. He paused at the gate, looking back one last time. The lanterns over the gravel glowed faintly, their light holding steady, as though the garden would continue listening long after he had gone. He bowed once more, then stepped through the gate and back into Kyoto's night. The lane carried him gently forward. His footsteps echoed faintly, then softened into silence. He felt the presence of the garden still within him, the pattern of gravel lines lingering like a memory behind his eyes. The trickle of water remained in his ears, steady as a heartbeat. He walked without needing to arrive anywhere. Kyoto was less a city to be reached than a rhythm to be entered. Lantern by lantern, stone by stone, it had folded him into its fabric. And as the night opened again before him, Haru found himself walking not through streets, but through listening itself. Chapter 13. The Bell Beneath the Trees. The lane narrowed again, its cobblestones uneven beneath Haru's feet. Lanterns were fewer here, and the darkness thickened, though not with menace. Kyoto's shadows felt different from other cities he had known. They were not something to push against, but something that allowed the night to breathe more deeply. He walked as though moving inside an ink painting, where the blank spaces carried as much meaning as the lines themselves. The air cooled, touched with the dampness of soil. Haru sensed he was nearing another temple. The faint outline of a torii gate soon appeared ahead, its wooden beams dark against the starlit sky. Beyond it, a path stretched upward, lined with towering trees. Their trunks rose straight and tall, their branches interwoven so densely that the night sky showed only in fragments, like shards of porcelain set into a vast black bowl. Haru placed his hand lightly on one of the gate's posts before passing through. The wood felt smooth, its grain worn down by countless hands before his own. He bowed his head slightly, then stepped forward onto the ascending path. The ground was packed earth here, with stones fewer. Each step released a faint crunch of gravel scattered between the roots. Cicadas sang in chorus from the trees, their voices rising and falling as though the night itself were pulsing. Haru moved slowly, letting their rhythm guide his breath. Halfway up the slope, he stopped. From deeper within the temple grounds, a bell rang. It was not the sharp clang of a street bell or the metallic jingle of a shop's door. This was deeper, fuller. The sound rolled outward in waves, each one carrying through the trees and into Haru's chest. He felt it vibrate against his ribs, then settle low, as if the bell had placed its resonance directly into his body. The strike faded, but its echo lingered, long, impossibly long. Haru stood listening until the sound dissolved into silence, though he could not say when the last trace had gone. Then, just as he thought it finished, another strike came. This one was slower, deeper still. The pattern repeated. Sound, vibration, echo, silence. Each time, Haru felt the silence lengthen, as if the bell were teaching him that silence was not absence but continuation. The bell sounded, and then it kept sounding within the quiet that followed. He closed his eyes. He remembered the words the lantern seller had spoken. Night teaches us something day cannot. Perhaps this was it, the way sound was allowed to linger, to dissolve into stillness, to become part of breath. When he opened his eyes again, the trees loomed even taller. They seemed to bow slightly under the bell's vibration, their branches trembling faintly as though in acknowledgement. Haru resumed his steps. The path carried him upward until he reached a clearing. There the temple stood, its roof lines sharp against the night sky, its wooden beams darkened with age. Lanterns glowed faintly along the eaves, each one shielded by paper shades painted with calligraphy. Their characters moved gently in the breeze, shadows dancing across the wood. At the edge of the courtyard stood the bell tower. It rose on thick wooden pillars, the great bronze bell suspended in the center. A heavy beam bound with rope hung ready to strike it. The bell's surface was dark, mottled with the patina of centuries. Haru could see faint inscriptions along its rim, too distant to read but unmistakably carved with care. No one stood at the tower now. The strikes he had heard must have come earlier. The bell rested, silent, yet its presence filled the courtyard more completely than any sound. Haru felt as if he were standing not beside an object, but beside time itself. He walked closer, pausing at the base of the steps that led to the tower. He did not climb. Instead, he bowed. Something in him understood that the bell was not meant to be approached casually. It was not merely a tool for sound, but a vessel for silence. From his vantage point, he could see the temple buildings arranged around the courtyard. Their sliding doors were shut, but faint light glowed within, suggesting monks or caretakers still moved quietly inside. Somewhere he caught the faint scent of incense, woodsy, resinous, carrying the hint of cedar and sandalwood. Haru sat on a low stone wall at the edge of the courtyard. He folded his hands loosely in his lap, letting his body settle into stillness. The bell did not sound again, but its earlier strikes still resonated within him. He found himself breathing more slowly, more deeply, as though his body had adopted the bell's rhythm. Time dissolved. Haru could not say if he sat for minutes or hours. The night sky above shifted slightly, stars wheeling imperceptibly overhead. The lanterns flickered along the eaves, their glow steady but never still. The trees at the courtyard's edge whispered occasionally in the wind, but never loud enough to disturb the silence the bell had left behind. At some point, movement drew Haru's gaze. A monk appeared at the far side of the courtyard, emerging through a sliding door. He was elderly, his head shaved, his robe a deep shade of gray. His steps were deliberate but light, barely stirring the gravel. The monk walked to the bell tower and stood at its base. He placed his hands together, bowed once, then climbed the steps. Slowly, with both hands, he grasped the rope bound around the heavy beam. He drew it back with steady care, then released it. The beam swung forward and struck the bell. The sound rang out fuller than before, vibrating through the courtyard, the temple, the trees, the earth itself. Haru felt it enter not only his chest, but his bones. It was less like hearing, and more like being struck awake by stillness. The monk bowed once more and left the tower. He did not look around to see if anyone had watched. His steps carried him quietly back inside the temple, and the door slid shut behind him. Haru remained seated, listening to the echo fade. The silence that followed seemed larger than before, as though the world itself had exhaled. He thought of the boy and his grandfather in the lantern shop. He thought of the woman tending the stone garden, her rake carving spirals into gravel. He thought of the gates and gardens he had passed, each one offering glimpses of beauty without demanding entry. And he thought of the bell, sounding not to mark time but to dissolve it. Perhaps this was what Kyoto offered, not answers, not solutions, but reminders. Each lantern, each stone, each sound was a mirror, returning him to the place within where silence already lived. He stood slowly, bowing once more toward the bell. Then he turned and walked back down the path, beneath the towering trees. The cicadas still sang. The gravel still crunched beneath his feet. Yet everything felt changed, as though the bell's vibration still carried through the earth, guiding his steps even as he left. The Torii gate appeared again at the bottom of the slope. Haru placed his hand on its post as before, but this time he lingered longer. He felt the cool wood under his palm, grounding him, steadying him. Then he stepped back through, leaving the temple behind. The night opened again, its lanterns waiting. Kyoto breathed around him, patient, unhurried, eternal. And Haru walked on, carrying the bell's silence within him. Chapter 14. The Bridge of Quiet Waters. The street welcomed Haru again as he stepped away from the temple's Torii gate. The trees thinned and the lanterns returned, soft, steady pools of light punctuating the dark. He carried the bell's vibration with him, the silence it had left behind still humming quietly in his bones. Each step seemed lighter, as though the night itself had folded into his rhythm. Kyoto was not asleep. It never was, not entirely. Even here, in its stillest corners, the city whispered. A door slid open somewhere, releasing a faint spill of lamplight. A distant shamisen note drifted across the rooftops. A dog barked once, then was silent. Haru walked with these fragments of sound, not as intrusions, but as threads in the tapestry the city wove each night. Ahead the street curved downward, leading toward water again. Haru followed it, his steps unhurried. He soon came upon another canal, wider than the narrow channels he had crossed before, yet not as grand as the Kamo River. Its surface reflected the night sky more clearly, the moon and stars rippling gently as if painted onto silk. A bridge arched across it, slender and graceful, its wooden rails polished smooth by years of hands resting upon them. Unlike the broad bridges of the city's busier districts, this one was narrow, intimate, made for quiet crossings, not bustling crowds. Haru paused at its entrance. The lanterns that marked each end burned lower than most, their flames flickering, their paper shades worn thin. Yet this only deepened their charm, as though the bridge itself wished not to draw attention, but to be known by those who noticed. He stepped onto the boards. They creaked faintly under his weight, releasing the soft aroma of old cedar. Halfway across, he leaned against the railing and gazed down. The water moved slowly, carrying the moon's reflection along its surface. A willow leaned close, its branches trailing into the canal. Each ripple fractured the moonlight into silver shards, then drew them together again. Haru thought of the temple bell and its echoes, sound breaking, sound reforming, silence holding it all. The water, too, seemed to teach the same lesson. A movement caught his eye. From beneath the bridge, a small boat emerged, its bow cutting through the reflection. A lantern hung at its stern, casting a warm oval of light across the water. Within the boat, an elderly man sat, his straw hat tilted low. He held a pole steady against the canal's bed, guiding the vessel with slow, practiced gestures. The boat slid silently beneath Haru's feet, its lantern swaying faintly as the water rocked. The man did not look up, but Haru bowed slightly anyway, unseen. When the boat passed, its light continued onward down the canal, leaving behind a faint shimmer that lingered like memory. Haru remained at the railing long after the boat disappeared. He let the silence of the bridge sink into him, the water's rhythm aligning with his breath. He thought of the countless feet that had crossed here, merchants, pilgrims, lovers, wanderers. Each had left something behind, though invisible. The bridge carried more than footsteps. It carried stories. When he finally moved on, Haru crossed to the far side and entered a narrower lane. Here the houses leaned more closely together, their upper levels jutting slightly over the street. Wooden lattices cast patterned shadows in the lantern light, and the faint smell of cooking drifted from a window left slightly ajar. He passed a small shrine tucked into a corner. Its roof was no taller than his chest, its stone base smoothed by centuries of rain. A pair of tiny fox statues flanked its entrance, their expressions sharp yet playful. Haru paused to bow lightly before it, then dropped a coin into the offering box. The faint clink echoed louder than expected in the hush of the lane. A breeze stirred as he walked on, carrying the sound of water again. He turned a corner and found himself beside a larger canal, this one lined with stone embankments. Lanterns floated here, dozens of them, drifting in slow procession along the water's surface. Their lights shimmered in reds, oranges, and soft whites, reflections rippling like a constellation come loose from the sky. Haru stood at the water's edge, entranced. He remembered the lantern festival he had once attended as a boy, when the river had carried away countless glowing prayers. Each flame had been a wish, a memory, a farewell. Here, too, the lanterns seemed alive, as though each carried a fragment of the city's breath. He followed the canal path for some time, letting the lanterns accompany him. The houses on either side grew quieter, their doors closed, their shutters drawn. Yet the water's glow kept the night alive, pulsing gently with every flicker of flame. Haru stopped at a stone bench and sat. From here, he could see the lanterns gather at a bend in the canal, clustering before dispersing again downstream. The sight reminded him of people, how they came together, lingered briefly, then drifted apart. Yet each flame, whether near or far, still belonged to the same current. He thought of his own life, the places he had traveled, the people he had known and left. He wondered whether he too was just a lantern drifting on water, carried by currents larger than himself. The thought did not sadden him, instead it comforted him. To be carried was not to be lost. The night deepened. A bell struck faintly in the distance, not the great resonance of the temple he had left, but a smaller, humbler bell, its sound lighter. Haru listened as it mingled with the lapping of water, then faded. He rose from the bench and continued along the canal. Eventually the path curved upward, away from the water, and led him back into the heart of the city. The lanterns floating behind him grew smaller, but their glow remained in his memory, a trail of light he carried inwardly. Kyoto opened again ahead, its streets waiting, its silence still speaking, and Haru walked on. Chapter 14. The Bridge of Quiet Waters. The street welcomed Haru again as he stepped away from the temple's torii gate. The trees thinned, and the lanterns returned, soft, steady pools of light punctuating the dark. He carried the bell's vibration with him, the silence it had left behind still humming quietly in his bones. Each step seemed lighter, as though the night itself had folded into his rhythm. Kyoto was not asleep. It never was, not entirely. Even here, in its stillest corners, the city whispered. A door slid open somewhere, releasing a faint spill of lamplight. A distant shamisen note drifted across the rooftops. A dog barked once, then was silent. Haru walked with these fragments of sound, not as intrusions, but as threads in the tapestry the city wove each night. Ahead, the street curved downward, leading toward water again. Haru followed it, his steps unhurried. He soon came upon another canal, wider than the narrow channels he had crossed before, yet not as grand as the Kamo River. Its surface reflected the night sky more clearly, the moon and stars rippling gently as if painted onto silk. A bridge arched across it, slender and graceful, its wooden rails polished smooth by years of hands resting upon them. Unlike the broad bridges of the city's busier districts, this one was narrow, intimate, made for quiet crossings, not bustling crowds. Haru paused at its entrance. The lanterns that marked each end burned lower than most, their flames flickering, their paper shades worn thin. Yet this only deepened their charm, as though the bridge itself wished not to draw attention, but to be known by those who noticed. He stepped onto the boards. They creaked faintly under his weight, releasing the soft aroma of old cedar. Halfway across, he leaned against the railing and gazed down. The water moved slowly, carrying the moon's reflection along its surface. A willow leaned close, its branches trailing into the canal. Each ripple fractured the moonlight into silver shards, then drew them together again. Haru thought of the temple bell and its echoes. Sound breaking, sound reforming, silence holding it all. The water, too, seemed to teach the same lesson. A movement caught his eye. From beneath the bridge, a small boat emerged, its bow cutting through the reflection. A lantern hung at its stern, casting a warm oval of light across the water. Within the boat, an elderly man sat, his straw hat tilted low. He held a pole steady against the canal's bed, guiding the vessel with slow, practiced gestures. The boat slid silently beneath Haru's feet, its lantern swaying faintly as the water rocked. The man did not look up, but Haru bowed slightly anyway, unseen. When the boat passed, its light continued onward down the canal, leaving behind a faint shimmer that lingered like memory. Haru remained at the railing long after the boat disappeared. He let the silence of the bridge sink into him, the water's rhythm aligning with his breath. He thought of the countless feet that had crossed here. Merchants, pilgrims, lovers, wanderers. Each had left something behind, though invisible. The bridge carried more than footsteps. It carried stories. When he finally moved on, Haru crossed to the far side and entered a narrower lane. Here the houses leaned more closely together, their upper levels jutting slightly over the street. Wooden lattices cast patterned shadows in the lantern light, and the faint smell of cooking drifted from a window left slightly ajar. He passed a small shrine tucked into a corner. Its roof was no taller than his chest, its stone base smoothed by centuries of rain. A pair of tiny fox statues flanked its entrance, their expressions sharp yet playful. Haru paused to bow lightly before it, then dropped a coin into the offering box. The faint clink echoed louder than expected in the hush of the lane. A breeze stirred as he walked on, carrying the sound of water again. He turned a corner and found himself beside a larger canal, this one lined with stone embankments. Lanterns floated here, dozens of them drifting in slow procession along the water's surface. Their lights shimmered in reds, oranges, and soft whites, reflections rippling like a constellation come loose from the sky. Haru stood at the water's edge, entranced. He remembered the lantern festival he had once attended as a boy, when the river had carried away countless glowing prayers. Each flame had been a wish, a memory, a farewell. Here, too, the lanterns seemed alive, as though each carried a fragment of the city's breath. He followed the canal path for some time, letting the lanterns accompany him. The houses on either side grew quieter, their doors closed, their shutters drawn. Yet the water's glow kept the night alive, pulsing gently with every flicker of flame. Haru stopped at a stone bench and sat. From here, he could see the lanterns gather at a bend in the canal, clustering before dispersing again downstream. The sight reminded him of people, how they came together, lingered briefly, then drifted apart. Yet each flame, whether near or far, still belonged to the same current. He thought of his own life, the places he had traveled, the people he had known and left. He wondered whether he, too, was just a lantern drifting on water, carried by currents larger than himself. The thought did not sadden him, instead it comforted him. To be carried was not to be lost. The night deepened. A bell struck faintly in the distance, not the great resonance of the temple he had left, but a smaller, humbler bell, its sound lighter. Haru listened as it mingled with the lapping of water, then faded, He rose from the bench and continued along the canal. Eventually the path curved upward, away from the water, and led him back into the heart of the city. The lanterns floating behind him grew smaller, but their glow remained in his memory, a trail of light he carried inwardly. Kyoto opened again ahead, its streets waiting, its silence still speaking, and Haru walked on. Chapter 16. The Silent Courtyard. The night deepened and Haru's footsteps grew slower, not from weariness but from a growing sense that the city itself asked him to move with greater care. Kyoto, at this hour, did not need haste. It asked for listening. He followed a narrow lane that seemed almost hidden, as though it revealed itself only when one was ready to see it. The cobblestones here were irregular, patched in places with moss. The lanterns that lined the way burned lower, their flames small but steady, like breaths taken in sleep. Haru noticed how quiet it had become. Even the cicadas seemed to have withdrawn their voices, leaving only the faint hush of leaves moving against one another. He wondered if the city had chosen this silence deliberately, as though preparing him for what lay ahead. At the lane's end, he reached a wooden gate. It was larger than most he had passed, but not imposing. Its planks were dark, its hinges old, and above it a pine leaned forward, sheltering the entrance as though guarding it. The gate stood slightly ajar. Haru paused, listening. Nothing stirred beyond. He placed a hand on the gate and pushed gently. It swung inward with a faint creak, revealing a courtyard bathed in moonlight. The space within felt almost otherworldly. A garden stretched across it, but unlike the others Haru had seen, this one was arranged around a central courtyard of stone. Large, flat slabs formed a pattern like rippling water, and in the center stood a single stone lantern. Its flame was unlit, yet it seemed luminous nonetheless, reflecting the pale glow of the moon above. Around the courtyard, the garden unfolded with quiet grace. A koi pond stretched along one side, its surface still enough to mirror the stars. A cluster of bamboo rose at the far end, their slender stalks swaying faintly, whispering secrets to the night. A plum tree leaned toward the courtyard, its branches heavy with blossoms that had opened despite the lateness of the season. Their fragrance, sweet and faint, drifted on the cool air. Haru stepped inside, his sandals brushing lightly against the stone. The courtyard embraced him with stillness. It felt as though the space itself were waiting, not empty, not abandoned, but attentive. He walked toward the stone lantern and placed his hand on it. The surface was rough, weathered by time and rain. He imagined how many hands before his had rested there, how many nights this lantern had stood witness to the city's turning hours. Though it bore no flame, it seemed to glow with a presence that did not depend on fire. Haru sat at the edge of the courtyard, near the koi pond. He leaned forward and watched the water. The fish moved slowly beneath the surface, their scales catching the moonlight in brief flashes. They seemed to swim without destination, each movement a gesture of ease. Haru felt his own breath fall into rhythm with them. He thought of his journey through the night, the lantern shop, the boy and his grandfather, the tea houses, the willow bending over the canal, the shrine on the hill, the tree strung with lanterns. Each had left an impression, not as memories to collect, but as stones set carefully in a garden path. They had guided him here to this courtyard, where silence itself felt like a companion. A soft sound reached him then, the faint trickle of water. He turned and saw a bamboo pipe feeding the pond, drops falling one by one. Each drop struck the surface with a ripple that spread outward, dissolving into stillness. The sound was steady, like a clock marking not hours but moments. Haru closed his eyes. He let the sound enter him, let it shape his breath. The courtyard, the pond, the bamboo, the plum blossoms, all seemed to gather into that rhythm. Time did not vanish. It simply thinned, stretched, until it no longer mattered. After a long while, Haru rose. He crossed to the far side of the courtyard, where a small wooden bench stood beneath the plum tree. The blossoms above him glowed faintly in the moonlight, each petal a pale lantern of its own. Some had fallen onto the bench, and as he sat, their fragrance rose around him. He leaned back and looked upward. Through the branches he could see the stars, scattered and bright. He thought again of the lanterns he had watched rise into the sky earlier, how they had joined the stars as though returning to a home they had always known. Kyoto, he realized, was not separate from the sky above. The lanterns, the canals, the gardens, the courtyards, they were all reflections of something larger. They taught not by words, but by mirroring the movements of the universe itself. Stillness and change, silence and sound, shadow and light, all woven into one rhythm. A faint breeze stirred and a petal drifted down, landing lightly on his sleeve. Haru lifted it carefully, holding it in his palm. It was soft, almost weightless, yet its presence filled him with quiet wonder. He set it gently onto the pond's surface. It floated there, carried slowly across the water, until a koi rose and disturbed it, sending ripples outward. The petals spun once, twice, then settled again, moving with the current. Haru smiled. The city, it seemed, was teaching him still that to release something was not to lose it, but to allow it to move with the larger flow. He remained in the courtyard until the moon had shifted westward, casting longer shadows across the stones. At last he stood and bowed toward the lantern, the pond, the blossoms, the silence. He stepped back through the gate, pulling it gently closed behind him. The lane outside was quiet, but Haru carried the stillness of the courtyard within him. Each step felt lighter, as though the silence walked with him. The city did not speak loudly, but it spoke with depth, and Haru had learned to listen. As he walked on, he realized the night was nearing its end. The air carried a subtle shift, the kind that comes before dawn. Yet the lanterns still burned, and the moon still shone. Kyoto was not finished with him yet, and he was not finished with it. Chapter 17. The First Light of Morning. The air had shifted. Haru felt it as soon as he stepped back onto the narrow street. The coolness still wrapped the city, but now it carried something softer, like the faint stirring of a secret about to be revealed. Kyoto's night had walked with him for so long, and yet, as the hours dissolved into the quiet promise of morning, he sensed the city preparing to let him go. The lanterns still glowed along the lanes, but their flames burned lower now, their light no longer fierce against the dark. Instead, they shimmered like gentle companions, waiting with him for the first color of dawn. Haru paused, realizing how different they looked in this moment. Earlier they had seemed eternal, keepers of silence, guardians of shadow. Now they felt more like guides that had carried him safely through the night, preparing to hand him into the care of day. He breathed deeply. The air was tinged with faint wood smoke from somewhere, and the distant, almost imperceptible scent of rice steaming. Life was stirring behind the closed doors, though no voices yet reached the street. Kyoto was beginning to inhale again, as though it too had slept, and was now preparing to rise. Haru followed the slope of the lane until it brought him once more to the canal. The water was darker now, reflecting not lanterns but the deep blue of the sky beginning to pale at the edges. He leaned against the railing and watched the surface ripple faintly. The moon, which had followed him all night, now rested low in the west, its reflection stretched and broken across the current. He thought of how the lanterns, too, had mirrored themselves in water, how the koi in the pond had moved without urgency, how the willow's branches had written slow poetry on the canal. Water had been everywhere tonight, flowing, reflecting, carrying light and shadow alike. It had shown him what it meant to move without clinging, to change shape without losing essence. The night had not spoken directly, yet it had whispered through these images, each one a lesson that did not need to be explained. A bell sounded then, not the long, resonant call of midnight, but something gentler. A temple bell rung in the hush before sunrise. Its tone rolled through the streets, low and steady, lingering until it dissolved into silence again. Haru closed his eyes. The sound passed through him, anchoring him in the moment. He remembered the words of the lantern seller. Night teaches us something day cannot. And now he felt the other side of that teaching. Night had given him stillness, silence, reflection. But it was not meant to last forever. Its gift was to prepare him for the day, to carry that silence into the noise of living, to hold the rhythm of the city inside his own body. He opened his eyes again. The sky had changed. Where it had been black and indigo, now there was the faintest wash of silver, spreading slowly like ink on paper. Haru walked on. The streets began to widen, the houses spaced further apart. A few shutters had been drawn open. Faint light glowed within, though the voices remained hushed. A farmer led a cart slowly along one lane, the wheels creaking against the stones. A woman swept the step of her tea house, her movements quiet, deliberate, her broom brushing rhythm into the silence. Kyoto was stirring, but unlike other cities Haru had known, it did not wake with noise and clamor. It rose gently, like a person who stretches before rising fully. Haru felt himself stretch with it, his steps slower, his senses alive to every gesture. He came to a small square he had not seen before. In its center stood a cherry tree, its blossoms pale even in the dim pre-dawn light. Some petals had fallen during the night, and now lay scattered across the stones. Haru crouched and picked one up. It was soft, nearly translucent. He held it in his palm, then let it fall again. It joined the others on the ground, part of a pattern too subtle to be designed, yet more beautiful for it. At the far edge of the square, a temple gate rose. Its wooden beams were dark with age, its roof sweeping upward like wings. Haru approached slowly. The gate stood open, as though welcoming not just him but the morning itself. He passed through. Inside, the temple grounds were hushed. Lanterns still burned along the path, but their light grew pale against the sky, which was now softening toward blue. A few monks moved silently, their robes brushing the stones. They carried no urgency, only presence. Haru watched them for a moment, then followed the path toward the main hall. In front of the hall, incense burned in a great bronze vessel. Smoke curled upward in delicate streams, twisting and dispersing into the air. Haru stepped forward and placed his hands together. He bowed, then closed his eyes. The smoke rose past him, carrying prayers he had not spoken but felt nonetheless. He thought of his walk through the city, of the lanterns, the canals, the tea houses, the courtyards, the shrines. He thought of how each had asked nothing from him but presence. Kyoto had not offered answers, but it had mirrored him back to himself. It had shown him that silence was not emptiness, but fullness, an invitation to see what already lay within. The sound of chanting began, soft and steady. A line of monks entered the hall, their voices blending in a rhythm that felt older than time. Haru stood listening, his heart moving with their cadence. It was not a chant of words he could understand, but of tones that reached beyond understanding. He felt something shift inside him, a loosening. The night's teachings settled into place, not as thoughts but as breath, as rhythm, as trust. When the chanting faded, the silence that followed seemed even deeper, as though the air itself remembered the sound. Haru stepped back outside. The sky was lighter now, streaked with soft hues of lavender and pale gold. The lanterns along the temple path flickered faintly, their flames paling as the world around them brightened. One by one they would be extinguished soon. But Haru no longer felt sadness in that. Their purpose had been fulfilled. He walked back through the gate and onto the street. The city was waking. A shopkeeper opened his shutters. A child ran past with laughter that pierced the quiet like birdsong. A dog barked faintly in the distance. Kyoto was returning to the rhythm of day, and Haru walked with it, carrying the silence of night inside him like a hidden lantern. At last, he reached the river. The Kamo flowed wide and calm, its surface touched by the first light of the sun cresting the hills. The sky above it glowed with soft gold, the kind of light that belonged not to night or day, but to the passage between them. Haru stood on the bank and watched the water move. It carried reflections of both, the lingering moon and the arriving sun. He realized then that Kyoto itself was like this river. It did not cling to night nor rush into day. It held both, mirrored both, allowed both to pass without resistance. And perhaps that was what the city had been teaching him all along, to move like water, to carry silence into sound, to let go without fear of loss, to reflect without needing to grasp. The sun lifted slowly. Its light fell across the rooftops, across the bridges, across the willows that trailed into the water. The lanterns, one by one, flickered out, their glow dissolving into day. But Haru did not feel them vanish. He felt them become part of him, each one a quiet flame that would remain within. He bowed slightly toward the river, toward the city, toward the night that had carried him here. Then, with a slow, steady step, he turned and walked into the morning. Chapter 18, The Gift of Morning. The sun had risen further by the time Haru crossed the bridge back into the heart of the city. Its light stretched across the rooftops, painting them with gold so soft it seemed to breathe. Shadows receded gently, not chased away, but folded back into their places as though bowing before the day. Kyoto was fully waking now. The streets, once silent companions to his wandering, held new sounds. Shopkeepers lifting shutters, birds swooping across tiled roofs, the faint clatter of wooden wheels as a cart passed with vegetables bundled in straw. It was not the loud, hurried awakening of a modern city, but a patient rising, like an old friend greeting the day with steady kindness. Haru walked slowly, letting each sound and sight enter him without hurry. He felt as though he was not merely moving through Kyoto, but that Kyoto was moving through him. Its rhythm, its pulse, its gentle balance of old and new. He came again to the willow tree by the canal. Its branches trailed in the water, scattering sunlight this time instead of lantern light. Haru leaned once more on the railing, and for a moment it felt as if the entire night had folded into this single image. The lanterns, the gardens, the chants, the silence. Everything had carried him here, to this soft, luminous moment, and in that moment he felt gratitude bloom. Not a thought, not even a word, but a warmth rising through his chest, as though the city itself had placed a quiet lantern inside him. He bowed slightly to the willow, to the water, to the memory of the night that had carried him. As he straightened, a voice stirred behind him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Haru turned. An elderly man stood nearby, holding a small basket of morning herbs. His back was slightly bent, his hands lined with years, yet his eyes carried the sparkle of one who had looked often at things and never grown tired of seeing them. Haru nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "It feels alive." The man smiled. "Kyoto is always alive, but the night shows its heart. The morning—" He lifted his basket slightly. "The morning shows its kindness." They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the willow sway. Then the man bowed lightly and continued on, his steps unhurried. Haru felt as though the words had been left behind for him, like a blessing. Night had given him its heart. Morning had given him its kindness. He walked on, following the curve of the canal until he came upon a small tea house he had not noticed before. Its door stood open, the Norran curtains swaying gently in the morning breeze. From within came the faint clink of porcelain. Something in him stirred. He stepped inside. The air carried the fragrance of roasted tea leaves and steamed rice. A woman in a pale kimono stood behind the counter, arranging cups on a tray. She looked up and smiled. "Good morning. You must be tired after walking so early." Her words were gentle, not prying, simply acknowledging. Haru felt warmth in them. He nodded. She gestured to a low table by the window. "Please, sit." Haru removed his shoes and lowered himself onto the tatami. The window beside him opened onto a small courtyard garden where a pine tree bent gracefully over a stone basin. Water dripped from a bamboo pipe into the basin, each drop echoing like a reminder of the night he had walked through. The woman returned with a tray. On it rested a bowl of steaming tea, a small plate of rice balls, and a single pickled plum. She set it down before him with care, then bowed slightly. "Eat slowly," she said. "The morning has time." Haru smiled and bowed in return. He lifted the tea bowl, feeling its warmth spread into his hands. He took a slow sip. The flavor was deep, earthy, alive. It filled him in a way no food had before, not just his body, but his spirit. He ate the rice balls, simple and perfect, each grain holding the taste of earth, sun, and care. The woman moved quietly in the background, tending to her space. Haru sat in silence, eating slowly, letting the moment be whole. And as he ate, he realized something. This was love. Not the kind spoken loudly, not the kind that declared itself with grand gestures, but the kind that appeared in the smallest acts, the setting of a tray, the brewing of tea, the opening of a door. Kyoto was full of this love. He had felt it in the lanterns, in the gardens, in the bow of a stranger, in the chant of monks. And now here it was, placed before him on a tray. He finished his meal and bowed deeply, his chest warm with gratitude. The woman smiled, her eyes soft. "Come again," she said simply. Haru nodded. "I will." He stepped back out into the street. The sun was fully risen now, the light brighter, but still soft with morning's grace. People moved through the lanes, children carrying books, merchants arranging their stalls, a woman laughing as she greeted a neighbor. The city had woken completely, yet Haru still carried the silence of night within him. As he walked, he realized he no longer felt like a visitor. He felt woven into the rhythm, part of the city's breathing. He reached again the wide river. The water shimmered beneath the sun, no longer silver, but gold. He stood on the bank, watching the current flow. Night had taught him silence. Morning had taught him love. He placed his hand lightly on his chest. He felt both there, steady, alive, ready to walk with him wherever he went. Haru smiled, not just with his lips, but with his whole being. The night's journey was complete, but its gift would remain, a lantern that did not extinguish with the morning, but glowed quietly within. He turned from the river, the light on his face, and stepped into the day. And in that step, he felt it. Joy. Not fleeting, not uncertain, but steady. Joy born of love, love born of presence, presence born of a single night in Kyoto. It would stay with him always.